headless bodies dumped in a landfill by the lake, right beneath the nose of Public Safety Director Elliot Ness. In 1930s Cleveland, was the killer sending a message to the whole city, or just to the man tasked with keeping it safe? It didn't stop there. As weeks turned into months, new fragments of human remains surfaced along the banks of Kingsbury Run, a no-man's land cutting through Cleveland's industrial heart. Heads vanished, limbs scattered. Some victims, even more disturbingly, showed signs of chemical burns. Who could possess such cold, clinical precision? What drove them to inflict this level of terror on a city already battered by the Great Depression? In the shadow of Cleveland's steel mills, a pattern of horror began to emerge. A pattern that seemed to mock the efforts of police and the city's leadership. But before we trace the killer's footsteps, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. The city, its people, and the era that allowed these crimes to unfold. From 1935 to 1938, the city of Cleveland found itself gripped by a string of brutal murders. Murders that would eventually be linked under the chilling label of the Torso murders. Some say the violence began even earlier, with a case known as the Lady of the Lake in 1934. A mysterious woman's torso found washed ashore, a grim precursor to what was coming. Victims were mostly the forgotten ones, the homeless, the jobless, those clinging to society's edge during the darkest days of the Depression. Their stories, rarely told in life, became headlines only in death. For Cleveland, nothing would ever be the same. But what message, if any, was the killer trying to send? Backdrop: victims, the city. To understand the grip of fear that descended on Cleveland, we must rewind. Back to the crumbling rail yards and shantytowns of Kingsbury Run. It was the mid-1930s, and the city, like much of America, was still staggering from the blow of the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce. Hope was scarcer. Men and women who once had steady lives now found themselves sleeping under makeshift roofs, living in the margins, invisible to the world around them. The Torso killer seemed to know this territory intimately. He preyed on the most vulnerable, the drifters, day laborers, women without families to miss them. Most would be classified as John or Jane Doe, their identities lost along with their heads. Official records count 12 victims, but some researchers expand that number to as many as 20, arguing that the pattern of brutality stretched beyond what the police could, or would, acknowledge. The first ominous sign may have come on September 5, 1934, when the lower half of a woman's torso, her identity forever unknown, washed up on the shore of Lake Erie, near Bratenahl. Locals would call her the Lady of the Lake. In retrospect, this chilling discovery looks less like an isolated tragedy and more like the killer's opening act. Over the next 4 years, the mutilated remains of men and women would be found, always with the same signature: decapitation. Some male victims were mutilated even further. In a few cases, investigators noted the victim's skin appeared reddish and leathery, evidence, perhaps, of chemical exposure. Was the killer experimenting, or simply ensuring no one could identify his work? This was the world in which the Torso murders took root, a city racked with poverty and fear, and a nameless predator exploiting every shadow. Even as bodies surfaced, the city's most desperate citizens found themselves more invisible than ever, unless, or until, they became a victim. Breaking point. Key events. Every city has its breaking point. For Cleveland, it came on a crisp September morning in 1935. On September 23rd, 2 mutilated bodies were discovered along Kingsbury Run, a desolate stretch near the city's rail yards. One victim was identified through fingerprints. Edward Andrassy, just 29 years old, known to police but hardly the sort you'd expect to become the centerpiece of a citywide nightmare. The other man would remain forever unidentified. Both had been decapitated, their heads never found. News of the gruesome discovery exploded across the city. For the first time, residents began whispering about a killer who hunted in the shadows. Someone precise, methodical, and utterly without conscience. The press gave the crimes a name that would haunt Cleveland for years: the Torso Murders. As autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, the horror only deepened. More bodies surfaced, some hidden in brush, others dumped near the Cuyahoga River, several left in plain sight, as if daring the police to stop him. Then, in August 1938, the killer struck with boldness that bordered on arrogance. On August 16th, 2 new victims appeared at the E 9th Street Lakeshore dump, right near the offices of Eliot Ness, Cleveland's famed director of public safety. Was it a taunt? A declaration that the killer could slip past even the city's most celebrated crime fighter? Just 2 days later, Ness would make a decision that remains controversial even today. By now, the city was in a state of siege. Patrols were increased. Rumors ran wild. Yet, with every new body, it seemed the killer was always one step ahead, melting into the city's labyrinth of rail tracks, alleys, and forgotten spaces. If the killer was seeking attention, he'd gotten it. But was he seeking something more? The investigation, witnesses, forensics, and dead ends. As the city reeled, investigators were thrust into a daunting maze. The crime scenes, Kingsbury Run, the lakeshore, derelict dumps, offered few reliable witnesses. The victims, chosen from society's most forgotten, left behind scant traces of their lives. Detectives painstakingly combed through the brush and debris, hoping for a single clue that might break the case open. Forensics in the 1930s was a developing science. Still, the patterns became impossible to ignore. Almost every victim had been decapitated, and the bodies were dismembered with clinical precision. Some corpses showed signs of chemical treatment, their skin toughened and reddened, possibly an attempt to obscure fingerprints or delay decomposition. The few victims who were identified, like Edward Andrassy, could be named only because their hands were left intact for fingerprinting. For most, lacking heads, names, and family to speak for them, they became nothing more than John Doe or Jane Doe in official files. At the helm of the investigation stood Eliot Ness, the legendary untouchable from Chicago. As Cleveland's director of public safety, Ness brought a new level of determination to the case. He authorized sweeps of the hobo camps in Kingsbury Run, rounding up vagrants and taking fingerprints, searching for both witnesses and possible suspects. This mass roundup would later be seen as both a show of force and a desperate gamble, designed to clear out the killer's hunting ground. But at what cost to the city's most vulnerable? Despite these efforts, the killer remained invisible. False leads and rumors piled up. Officially, the Torso case counted 12 victims, but some investigators believed the number was higher, perhaps stretching into the late 1940s. Yet, every time authorities thought they saw a pattern, the killer changed course. Was he hiding in plain sight? Was he one of them, a local, a drifter, or someone no one would ever suspect? As months passed with no arrests, faith in the police began to fray. The chilling realization set in: Cleveland's most infamous predator might never be caught. But the hunt was far from over. The turning point, critical evidence and main suspects, August 18, 1938. Just 2 days after the bodies at the lakeshore dump were discovered, Elliot Ness made his most controversial move. At dawn, he led a team to burn down the shanty towns of Kingsbury Run, destroying the haphazard shelters that dotted the ravine. Officially, the goal was to drive out the killer's hunting ground, scatter potential suspects, and restore order. But the fires also erased the only refuge many desperate people had left. It was a show of force, a statement that the city would not be held hostage by fear. Yet it left the question hanging. Had the real killer already slipped away, lost among the hundreds displaced that morning? As the investigation dragged on, attention turned to a handful of suspects, each surrounded by shadows, none ever convicted. The most prominent name was Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a skilled surgeon with personal demons. Sweeney had a reputation for instability and, according to reports, failed a polygraph test during questioning. Afterward, he checked himself into a psychiatric institution, where he remained for years. The lack of physical evidence meant authorities could never charge him. Still, for many, especially Ness, Sweeney lingered in the background, like a ghost haunting the investigation. Years after the murders, Ness himself received taunting postcards signed by someone claiming to be the killer. Whether those messages truly came from Sweeney remains a mystery. Another suspect, Frank Dolezal, was arrested in 1939 and confessed, only to later recant. Before his case could go to trial, he died in jail under suspicious circumstances, ruled as suicide. Many modern analysts believe Dolezal was a scapegoat, pressured by the system to confess to crimes he did not commit. Decades later, a new twist emerged. Forensic teams began to exhume the remains of unidentified victims, including the notorious tattooed man, hoping that advances in genetic genealogy might finally provide answers, if not about the killer, then at least about those whose names were lost to history. The hope, perhaps someday, the long-buried secrets of Kingsbury Run would come to light. Trial, verdict, and lingering shadows for all the tireless effort, the relentless searches, and the desperate measures, the Cleveland Torso murders never found closure in a court of law. No trial was ever held. No verdict was rendered. The city and the families of the victims were left with nothing but unanswered questions and a haunting sense that justice had slipped through their fingers. The two primary suspects, Dr. Francis Sweeney and Frank Dolezal, both faded into the realm of speculation. Sweeney, with his medical background and rumored mental instability, remained a focus for investigators. Yet, lacking any direct evidence, authorities could never move beyond suspicion. Dolezal, meanwhile, died in custody before his confession could be examined in court. The truth behind his death, whether suicide, accident, or something more sinister, remains another riddle in the case's long history. With no one to stand trial, the Torso murders settled into a kind of legal limbo. Officially, the record closed with a dozen victims, their names mostly unknown, their stories told only through autopsy reports and faded photographs. The public's appetite for answers was never satisfied, and for years, rumors swirled through Cleveland's streets, each theory more outlandish than the last. Was the killer a doctor using the city's forgotten-as practice for a twisted science? Was he a drifter, a phantom who vanished as quickly as he struck? Or did he remain in plain sight, shielded by power or status? As decades passed, the case became legend. A cautionary tale whispered in the dark, proof that even the most determined police work can be thwarted by chance, by fear, or by a killer who knew how to hide in the cracks of society. In the end, the Torso murders stood as a chilling reminder. Sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that refuse to be solved. Aftermath, impact, and unanswered questions. The shadow of the Torso murders stretched far beyond the crime scenes and the 1930s headlines. For Cleveland, the psychological wounds ran deep, especially among the city's most vulnerable. The homeless, the struggling, those living at the edge of society. These were the people who had always felt unseen, and now they lived in fear, knowing the killer chose his victims from their midst. Neighborhoods around Kingsbury Run never quite recovered their sense of safety. For years after, parents whispered warnings to their children, and city officials faced hard questions about how the case was handled. The drastic actions of Eliot Ness, most notably the burning of the hobo camps, became a symbol of both the city's desperation and its inability to protect its own. Some saw Ness as a hero who took bold steps to end the killings. Others criticized him for targeting society's poorest, for sacrificing the innocent along with the suspected. To this day, historians and true crime researchers still debate whether Ness's crackdown actually stopped the murders or merely scattered the evidence and displaced witnesses. Yet, the legacy of the Torso murders did not end with faded newspaper clippings. In recent years, the rise of genetic genealogy and modern forensics has breathed new life into the case. Unidentified victims, such as the tattooed man, have been exhumed for DNA analysis in hopes that the dead might finally reclaim their names and perhaps offer new clues to the killer's identity. Organizations like the DNA Project bring a glimmer of hope, not just for answers, but for a measure of dignity for those lost to history. Still, the questions linger. Was justice ever within reach? If so, at what cost? And if the Torso killer is still out there, what does it say about the secrets a city can keep? For Cleveland, and for the world, the Torso murders remain a chilling testament to how darkness can thrive when the light isn't bright enough, or when we're afraid to look. Legacy, lessons, and the unfinished story. Today, the Cleveland Torso murders remain one of America's most haunting unsolved cases, a dark chapter that continues to cast its shadow nearly a century later. Officially, the killer was never caught. No trial was held, and the victims' families were left to grieve with no one held accountable. The city moved on, but the scars beneath the surface never truly faded. The impact of the case can still be felt. For law enforcement, it became a cautionary tale about the limits of forensic science and the dangers of underestimating a calculating predator. The legacy of Eliot Ness, once a symbol of incorruptible justice, was complicated by the Torso case, a reminder that even heroes are not invincible, and sometimes the best efforts are met with silence from the truth. Decisions like burning the shantytowns at Kingsbury Run are still debated. Was it a bold stroke to protect the city, or a desperate act that destroyed lives and evidence alike? Yet, in recent years, new hope has emerged. The rise of DNA technology and investigative genealogy offers the possibility that the nameless may finally be given back their identities. Projects like DNA Project continue the search, not just for the killer, but for a measure of respect and dignity for the victims, reminding us that each name restored is a small victory over oblivion. Perhaps that is the lesson left behind by the Torso murders. Beneath the lurid headlines and lingering fear lies a plea for compassion, for the forgotten, for the marginalized, for those whose stories end too soon and too brutally. This tragedy warns us that every city has its shadows, and that sometimes the true test of justice is not just in catching a killer, but in refusing to let the lost be forgotten. As Cleveland continues to search for answers, The Torso murders stand as a somber reminder. Some mysteries demand not just investigation, but humanity. If you found this case as haunting as we did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more unsolved mysteries and hidden stories from the shadows of history. The Cleveland Torso murders shook an entire city to its core, leaving a trail of unanswered questions, shattered lives, and a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Decades later, the search for truth, justice, and identity continues, driven by both science and compassion.